Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Happy Friday. My name is Sandy Campbell. I'm the Executive Director of the Santa Fe Council on International Relations, and we are thrilled you've joined us. We are at the end of our second week of conference, and what a spectacular adventure it's been so far. We have some great talks coming up. We have just confirmed Bob Woodward to join our closing event. That's on December 3rd. He'll be in conversation with the one and the only Dana Priest, who will then segue, as only Dana can, into interviewing Peter Baker, the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, and Susan Glasser. And we'll also feature Joel Simon, who's the executive director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. That's on December 3rd and starts now at 5 p.m. Mountain Time to allow us to accommodate all these amazing speakers. So we have a lot coming up. We've also covered a lot of ground. We had an absolutely extraordinary talk last night with Dr. Hani Farid. He's a professor at UC Berkeley. He's an expert on deep fakes. He did something with his presentation that left us all a little bit amazed in terms of how he put his graphics on the screen, and of course, all the content that he was walking us through. And I thought, just for a quick piece of fun, we might just take a look at some comments that he had to make last night about our use of social media. So for those of you who saw it, revisit this. For those of you who didn't see Hani Farid present, here's just a little taste of what he had to say.
Here's the other thing, by the way, not so much for you and the people on this talk, but for everybody else, is stop getting your news on Facebook, man. I mean, what are you doing? Like, this is not, I mean, this is insane. We're getting our news from Twitter and from Facebook and YouTube and TikTok. Knock it off. Like, this will solve half of our problems. Like, understand that the folks who do the really hard work of investigative reporting and the editing team are incredibly good at their jobs. And there's a reason why we should pay for the New York Times and the Washington Post and the likes, is that's where you get trusted information. So, some of this is just good old fashioned, stop being a knucklehead.
I like that a lot. Stop being knuckleheads. Get our information from the real sources that produce and create it. He, of course, showed us as well how Jennifer Lawrence can become a very beautiful Steve Buscemi. And it was a really fascinating talk. So on that point, if you missed it, it's on our YouTube channel. Subscribe and you'll never miss another one. And of course, it's also on our website, journalismunderfire.org. And it's like many of the talks we've had. I'm thinking of Maria Ressa's talk on Monday night too, which was just spectacular. And so there's lots of goodies there. Go and check them out. So let's move to today. Today, of course, we are joining our conference stream with that of the World Affairs Councils of America, which is a great privilege. And so a big hello to all my colleagues and friends out there from the WACA network. We are thrilled to be joining you here today. And on that note, let me introduce Bill Clifford, who is the president and CEO of WACA. Welcome, Bill.
Good morning, Sandy. Good afternoon from Washington, D.C. here. And hello, everybody at the Santa Fe Council on International Relations and your great conference.
Speaking of conferences, Bill, I know you've been in conference all week. How's your conference going?
Thanks for asking, Sandy. Yes, we've had a week-long virtual conference. Usually we meet in Washington at the Mayflower Hotel for 3 very intensive days. We're not quite so ambitious as you. We only stretched out our virtual program to a full week. We've had some great keynotes, some excellent think tank briefings, and we've honored those council leaders and councils that have done amazing things over the course of the year, including 2 of your colleagues, one at the Columbus Council in Ohio and the other at the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. We have a surprise for you.
Oh, I like surprises.
Well, in recognition, Sandy, of the 3 years of journalism under fire and how you've grown it and how you've transitioned to this digital universe we all inhabit, and you've done it so effortlessly. For you, your board of directors, and your team, I wish I could be there in person to do this, but we are presenting you with the WACA 2020 Council of the Year Award, shared with 2 colleagues, but really you've earned it with your fantastic conference. So I want to commend you and everyone at CFCIR on the great job you've done this year and every year.
Well, thank you so much, Bill. It's a great honor. We are absolutely privileged and honored to receive that. Thank you. Let me just say a couple words of thanks on that note. as you pointed out, this is very much a team award. So let me thank some truly essential folks to all this. We have such an incredible team here in Santa Fe. So let me thank Shelley Winship, our Director of Development, Takara Lake, our Director of Education, who's just done such an amazing job at growing our programming in high schools and colleges, Susan J., our Office Manager, and Joey Schultz as the leader of our International Visitor Program, which we hope comes back soon. Brilliant folks, each of them, such a wonderful team. And then, of course, there's the president of our board of directors, the one and only Chuck Case, the irreplaceable Chuck Case, who's walked step by step with me. He's walked step by step with me on this grand journey of reinventing our council over the last 4 years. I couldn't have done any of this without you, Chuck. We enjoy lots of donor support. So for all of you out there who've given big and small, thank you so much for it. To our members, of course, we have 550 members. We have amazing community partners from, the Santa Fe New Mexican to various restaurants, and on we go. We're so thankful for that. You all make CIR the special thing it is. And for Journalism Under Fire, which has really become our signature event, I have to give a huge thank you to Dana Priest of the Washington Post, who's just been such an amazing individual at helping us not only get all kinds of different speakers, but in moderating and lending her amazing moderating skills to various different panels. And lastly, we're really looking forward to doing this in Santa Fe next year, because there's just that thing of when people get to come together, and not only do we get to hear amazing journalists from around the world, but we get to bring in journalists from around the world through State Department and the amazing support that we get through the International Visitor Leadership Program. First year, we had 48 journalists from every corner of the world. Last year, we had 26 journalists from across sub-Saharan Africa. And that just lends a whole different feeling to the conference. And of course, we're a happy member of the WACA network. And boy, I get so many ideas, so much advice, and even speakers and speaker, emails, those precious things from my fellow colleagues. So thanks, of course, to you. One last thing, I really want to thank my wife, Michelle, for all the support you've given me. You're my rock, my water, my sun. Thank you so much. And thank you, Bill. This is a great honor. Let's go on to today's program, shall we?
Well, thanks, Sandy. I hope that next year, I so much enjoy this collaboration with you as a former journalist. And I hope that, next year we can align so that we're partnering again, but that I can visit you to present the award in person, and you can visit us to be at our national conference in Washington. May it be so. May the pandemic be past us. And I look forward to this discussion coming up with our great panel.
I do too. Thank you, Bill. We'll see you soon, I hope, and have a happy discussion and enjoy. Oh, and I'll just say one last thing for folks out there: ask your questions in the Q&A panel, and we'll get to them when the time comes. So
I'll be monitoring the Q&A. Well, thanks everybody, and welcome to Covering Crisis in China. Again, as a former journalist myself who spent better than a dozen years based in Tokyo covering Asia, it's a pleasure to see some very familiar faces and a new face. So first I'll introduce the panelists, and then we'll get into the discussion. Julie McCarthy is Southeast Asia correspondent and Manila bureau chief at NPR. She's an award-winning reporter and editor who, for the past 25 years, has covered stories on 6 continents, from posts in New Delhi, Islamabad, Rio de Janeiro, the Middle East, Tokyo, and Washington, D.C. She reports on, well, everything. Many a hot war, many a fragile peace, presidents, prime ministers, protesters, but her favorite stories are about the common man or woman doing uncommon things. Julie is proof that earning old-fangled degrees in literature and history can take you far. Bob Davis is senior editor at the Wall Street Journal. These days, Bob covers economic issues out of the Washington, D.C. Bureau, especially those that emerged during the presidential campaign and faced the incoming Biden administration. Bob also continues to write about China, where he was posted from 2011 to 2014. He and his journal colleague Lingling Wei co-wrote Superpower Showdown, a history of the U.S.-China trade and economic standoff. It's a great book that came out this summer. Like Julie, Bob is a recipient of many awards. He was part of a journal team of reporters that won the 1999 Pulitzer Prize in International Reporting for the paper's in-depth coverage of the Russian financial crisis. I mentioned Lingling Wei. So greatly unfortunate that she was caught up in a terrible fire accident yesterday and is not able to join us. Our thoughts are with Lingling and her family. To the rescue, Sofia McFarland, China Deputy Bureau Chief at the Wall Street Journal, has kindly agreed to step in. And since none of you have had seen her bio, let me just say that in June, the Wall Street Journal restructured its China operations with 3 deputy bureau chiefs. Sofia is one of them, and she coordinates US-based reporters for stateside coverage of Beijing-Washington relations. This is Sofia's 3rd tour with the China Bureau and 2nd as deputy. She spent 2 years between her latest China stints as an editor for the journal's Weekend Exchange section. A native of Sweden, she started at the Journal as a news assistant in 1990 and has bounced between Asia and the US with postings in Manila, Beijing, and Hong Kong. Sofia lives in New York City with her daughter, her son, and 2 Chinese and Swedish-speaking grandchildren. Welcome, Sofia, Julie, and Bob.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Julie, I'm going to start with you. And let's bury the lead and leave the new Chinese national security law, which is affecting Hong Kong, to the side for a moment and bring it some context. Few episodes have been really as revealing for the world as what Beijing may be thinking than its recent activities in Hong Kong and what's going on the ground in Hong Kong. You've spent about a year or so amid the unrest and the pro-democracy movements and clashes there. What's going on in Hong Kong now? What does it look like, everyday life, and what's the climate?
Well, today, the residents, the academics, the activists sum up the atmosphere by saying it's fear, it's anxiety, it's uncertainty. And Beijing accomplished this all without tanks. It did it with laws, and chiefly the national security law. It was Beijing's answer to Hong Kong's season of unrest. And effectively, it criminalizes dissent and elevates patriotism, as defined by the Chinese Communist Party, to be the governing force of political life. The law really transformed Hong Kong from a relatively free place to one where shouting a particular slogan could get you arrested. The offenses include colluding with foreign governments. Does that mean testifying before Congress? We're not sure. There's subversion. Does that mean saying, liberate Hong Kong, revolution of our times? We're not sure. That became a battle cry during the protests. In fact, the battle cry, that very battle cry, was shouted by graduates at the Chinese university this week during an online graduation ceremony. And the police are now looking for those students. So the national, and this law was not supposed to be yielded proactively or retroactively, yet it has been. They've gone after activists such as the young Joshua Wong for a participation in a protest last year, 2019, October. The free press in Hong Kong is under assault. It's gone from being the 18th in a global press index, a freedom index, to 88th. Investigative journalists are being arrested on the pretext of we're not quite sure, making false declarations. And journalists are also reporting a rise in self-censorship. The penalties under this law are drastic, and the claims and the crimes are sort of broad and they're ill-defined. And Beijing is also eyeing Western journalists. This summer, the New York Times correspondent, Chris Buckley, had his visa extension denied. An Irish journalist was also denied. And it's prompted the New York Times to vacate its digital operations in Hong Kong. That's a very big move. So, every day this law brings something new. This week, there was 4 democratically elected legislators being suspended. But finally, I would point out this. Hong Kong is a story about how rapidly things unspool. A year ago today, I was standing on the campus of Polytech University, pitched battles between the police and the students in what produced some of the worst violence of the entire season of pro-democracy protests. Nothing like that exists today on campuses or the streets. Beijing has shut it all down by means of law. So it just goes to show you how rapidly things can change and add uncertainty.
Julie, to put this in a little bit of a broader historic perspective. Since the 1997 Hong Kong handover from British authority to Chinese rule, and some would say it's not so much a handover as a Chinese takeover, there have been a lot of protests. In 2003 about national security reform in maybe a more moderated issue guise. In 2012 over high school education curriculum, the umbrella revolution of a few years ago, and now 2019 last summer over the extradition. Could China have behaved another way if there had been perhaps a more moderated engagement from the Hong Kongers, or was this just an inevitable thing under Xi's leadership?
Well, it would seem to be, I mean, look, there was definitely a clash of visions of the world, right? In Hong Kong, used to vibrant, open press, independent courts, freedom of expression, freedom of association, clashing directly with the mainland mentality, which is the antithesis of this. It's lock it down and control the message. Under the basic law, Hong Kong's mini constitution, it had 50 years to have substantial self-rule, basic autonomy from the day of the handover in 1997. What's happened basically is that in this drive to crush dissent, that entire law has been eclipsed. China has broken that agreement and it's accelerated the clock. Could you argue that they were given a pretext by unrest on the streets? You could argue that. But it seems as though this really telegraphs that Xi Jinping, certainly in the last 6 months in Hong Kong, has showed the world how he intends to operate. He has also calculated that the world, which is spinning from a pandemic and very distracted, is not going to challenge China over Hong Kong to the extent that it would produce any kind of dire consequences for China. While Hong Kongers ultimately conclude that the world is not coming to the rescue, and if there's going to be any sort of fighting, they're going to have to do it alone. But I would also say it's easy to write off and say the game is over. Beijing's project to absorb Hong Kong to the mainland fold is well underway. But I say watch this space. Hong Kong is still Hong Kong, and there's a lot of fierce hearts there.
Very good. Turning to Sofia McFarland and to the mainland, Sofia, we were going to feature Lingling Wei today, and because it's very personal for her, she was one of the journal reporters who earlier this year was expelled from Beijing. And I know you've reported there. Could you talk about what has changed and what impact that had on her and on the journal bureau there?
Sure. Well, I came to China the first time in 2008, and it was a very different climate back then, where there was a certain sense of opening. The Beijing Olympics had just happened, and that gave this feeling that China was starting to engage with the world in a whole new way, and we saw that in our reporting and in our dealings with the Chinese government. There's always been this dance between foreign reporters and the Chinese government, where they will always object to reporting on certain topics that they consider sensitive and core to the Communist Party. You know what they are: Taiwan, Tibet, Tiananmen Square. We, of course, continue to report on those things, and when they objected, there would be a stern talking to, and then that would be that. The climate today is much different, and there is a sense of hardening, and that's what led to the expulsions earlier this year. That and a deteriorating relationship with the U.S. So that's what Lingling has gotten caught up in, and as you say, it's very personal for her. Lingling is the kind of journalist that any editor dreams of working with, who is not only extremely driven and energetic, but who also has this specific journalistic talent of getting people to want to tell her things. And, that's valuable for any reporter. But when the topic at hand is the thinking of Communist Party officials and what's really going on in Beijing, that has been just extra valuable and something that very few reporters can offer. And so for the journal, the cooperation that we've seen between Bob and Lingling, where we feel like we have really been able to take readers into the corridors of both Beijing and Washington, that has kind of symbolized that earlier sense of opening I was talking about between the U.S. and China, and a willingness to understand each other better. And so Lingling now, of course, feels that now she has instead become a symbol of what she would say is the bomb ashes, or she's become collateral damage of the deterioration between Beijing and Washington.
So she reports out of New York also, and so if you could, before I turn to Bob and have him take us back to the beat in Beijing, could you tell us a little bit about the journal's restructuring and what it means to cover China from here? I know you still have assets in China, but can you talk about what that restructuring has meant and the sourcing and the other obstacles to coverage?
Sure. So this started in the fall of last year, when first one reporter was expelled or had his visa credentials revoked, which is the same as expulsion, because your press credentials are the basis for your visa. And a few months later, 3 more reporters, and then in March, the big wave that hit not just the Wall Street Journal, but also the New York Times and the Washington Post. So all in all, about a dozen reporters had to leave, all of them with American passports. And that's it's hard to describe how devastating a blow that was for us. And I remember we had a conference call late at night, and everyone was just stunned and didn't know what to say. Some people had lived in China for decades and now had 10 days to leave. We decided very early on that we were not going to let that stop us from reporting on China and the goings on there. And as you said, we have people left there. Not all our reporters were Americans, so we still have people on the ground, foreign reporters, and so that has led to us having close contact with each other. And for an example, we can start to report a full-length feature story here. And then when we need to talk to people on the ground, we enlist them. It's not one of them may help us travel to a village we want to visit and ask the questions and kind of be a stand-in for the reporter who's now in New York. So for
that's a good jump. Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, not at all. That's just worked surprisingly well. But the daily feel of life in Beijing or in Shanghai, for the reporters who now work here, they don't have that, and with time, that's going to matter more and more.
Well, I wanted to take that point of being out in the village right to Bob, because Bob, when you went 9 years ago for a 3 or so year stint, starting in 2011, you didn't just report in Beijing. You got around the country and you were looking on a China that was changing rapidly then as well. What kind of impediments or harassment, or did people follow you? Can you describe anything like that you experienced, or were you free to choose the stories that you wanted and report them? And you're muted, Bob. You got to unmute your There you go.
The phrase of the era, you're on mute. So let me just start a little bit more on Lingling, because I just want the audience to understand. So Lingling was born in China, raised in China, married a Chinese person, came to the United States as a grad student, and her husband's a scientist. And at that time, America actually welcomed immigrants and scientists. So she became a citizen. And she's very, very unusual in the Western press corps of being essentially a Chinese citizen. She had to give up her passport, but of being essentially a Chinese citizen and a US citizen. So because she has a blue passport, she did report, under her own byline, work sources, operate as any reporter, although way better than most. But when she was kicked out, and also her family history is amazing. Her grandfather was an aide to Mao Zedong and went on the whole Long March with him, and was one of his most loyal aides. So 2 generations later, his granddaughter is in the White House watching a signing of the U.S.-China trade deal. It's just an amazing family story that reflects so much of China. And so when she was kicked out, it wasn't only professional. Yeah, it was true, as Sofia said, there were a lot of reporters who had spent decades there and now were kicked out. But she lost her entire family. Her family is all in China. It was a very personal loss for her. So I just want to sort of make that point.
Thank you.
So when I was there, from 2011 to 14, I covered economic issues. Economic issues are, by nature, less sensitive than, say, people reporting out of Xinjiang and so on. But even then, and also Xi Jinping was just coming, into full flower. So, but even then, certain things, it always amazed me, actually, the certain things that they would find political. So for instance, one time, one of my favorite things was going into, what they call fourth tier cities, sort of cities you never heard of that have 1 million people. And we were doing a story on the property bubble, what we thought was a property bubble. And I was with my Mandarin was pathetic, and I went with a Singaporean reporter of ours who spoke, was a native Chinese speaker. So we didn't need a news assistant with us at that particular moment. But every once in a while, the press people from the city would come and stop and say, "Can we help you?" And then we would say, "No, we're doing fine." Obviously watching what we were doing and trying to discourage people from talking to us. But at the same time, when we were in this town in the north, there was a European camera crew there that was doing something also, I think, on the property bubble, and they did have a Chinese fixer. And what was happening to that particular crew was the city authorities kept going to that video crew and trying to get the Chinese news assistant to come and talk to them separately, and they wouldn't allow it. But finally, they said, "Just go talk to them. Just get them out of our hair." And what they said to this Chinese news assistant was, "You have a nice daughter. We see she's doing really well in school. We hope she continues to do well in school." That was enough. That was just enough, right? That they're watching her, that they knew a family situation. So I always felt, I didn't have, because again, I wasn't covering dissidents and so on. I didn't worry about that sort of thing. What was the worst? Honestly, what was the worst thing they were going to do to me? They were going to throw me out. So I'd come back. I'm largely a Washington reporter. I'd come back and report out of Washington. The people that were heroes there, I thought, were the Chinese reporters who dealt with far greater pressure than we ever did, and also because of the way China is structured. If you're a Chinese national, you can't get a byline. So they would just have a little tagline, very unglamorous, but enormously important, and they faced real pressure.
Speaking of those journalists, and as a bridge back to Julie and her comments on the new national security law that China put in place at the end of June, talk briefly, Bob, first about how the United States, how the Trump administration has responded to the Hong Kong, the security law going into effect, and has the Trump administration thought of sanctions or visa restrictions and the like?
Yeah, no, the Hong Kong national security law was really important. So, I mean, in the book that I wrote with Lingling, we talked about the trade and economic battle. The first 2 years of the Trump administration, that was the tip of the spear. That was what the two countries were fighting about. And then, so, you know, it was very nasty and dragged out and all that. And then in January 2020, they got a deal. You can think it's a good deal, a bad deal, or whatever, but trade was off to the side. At that point, coincidentally, COVID starts sweeping across the globe. Trump gets entirely pissed because, you know, this is the biggest threat to his reelection. And he also, obviously, the United States is doing a terrible job in coping with this crisis. So at that point, the trade officials, the hawkish trade officials who had dominated the first couple of years, people like the trade representative Robert Lighthizer, or the wacky trade official in the White House, Peter Navarro, kind of lose a little clout and status because their issues are basically taken care of. And then what happens is people like Secretary of State Pompeo, Deputy National Security Advisor Matt Pottinger, Wilbur Ross, who would, you know, flits from one era to the other, but becomes very hawkish, and they try a variety of different measures that are traditional foreign policy kind of measures, national security, visa restrictions, all that sort of thing. And you know, the funny thing is, although we think of Trump as, you know, this China hawk, he is a China hawk on economic issues largely, but on China foreign policy issues, really isn't. So he had been, for those first 2 years, a restraining influence on the hardliners he had in his national security apparatus, and who would privately complain, you know, that they couldn't get traction on Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang. Well, once the national security law came into effect, that, in addition to COVID, freed up the national security hawks. And so you had one measure after another measure after another measure. Now with Hong Kong, I mean, it's largely visa restrictions and so on. And there is a question, as Julie brought out, like I mean, it is a terrible thing the Chinese government is doing, but there is no disagreement that Hong Kong is part of China. It was handed over. They did agree to abide by certain restrictions, and they haven't kept their word. But there is a limit, honestly, to what, you know, the U.S. could do. So what were they willing to do? They were willing to put, you know, visa restrictions and sort of middling level sanctions on Hong Kong. But what they weren't willing to do and are not willing to do is something that will really hurt China. For instance, sanctioning a major Chinese bank, cutting off a major Chinese bank from the dollar. That would be an enormously powerful system. It would be treating China in the way that we treat North Korea and Iran. They aren't willing to do that, and I don't see any evidence whatsoever that the incoming administration is willing to do that also. So I think you'll see largely symbolic measures against Hong Kong.
Thanks, Bob. I'm seeing questions come in from the audience, which I'm glad of, and we will get to them shortly. I'm going to have a question for Julie and then for Sophia, and we'll go to the audience questions from there. So keep them coming. Julie, let's talk about something specific out of this national security law. A very prominent person that most Americans may not have heard of is Jimmy Lai. Jimmy was arrested on charges of treason in August. Who is he, and what does his arrest signal for that fear, that climate of fear that you talked about?
Jimmy Lai really poses this question, and it's an extraordinary one. How many business tycoons would risk their fortune for democracy? Jimmy Lai basically has. He's a 72-year-old media tycoon. He's the owner of a pro-democracy newspaper. Apple Daily. He was arrested in August, handcuffed, marched through his own newsroom. He's out on bail. But Beijing wants to paint the longtime democracy promoter, really, as a traitorous troublemaker. And that really rattled Hong Kong. He's charged with a vague offense, colluding with foreign forces, which can carry a life sentence. It's not clear what that's based on, but he did meet in the past with Trump officials, including Vice President Pence. As one friend told me, he charms them. He's a scrapper. One analyst called him someone with a bar fighting mentality. Now, you would expect someone like this to be both beloved and polarizing at the same time, and he is. But in attacking Lai, the government went after one of the longest standing veterans of the pro-democracy movement. You know, whether you like or loathe Jimmy Lai, that's just a fact about him. And they sent a signal to the press, toe the line. But, it seems, Bill, that his newspaper, the Apple Daily, which is kind of a combination of gossip and investigation and interesting commentary on the political issues of the day, is less the issue with him than the fact he is a pro-democracy advocate who happens to have a bullhorn in the form of a newspaper. He's extremely wealthy. He owns a yacht called Free China, but he won't say whether that's an adjective plus a noun, as in a description, Free China, or whether it's a verb plus an object, which means it's an imperative, Free China. Jimmy Lai is also an outlier in the sense that he's one of the very few owners of a major media outlet in Hong Kong that is not in some way connected to the Chinese Communist Party. He's unique for his independence. And over the years in Hong Kong, major television, newspaper, media outlets are peppered with people who have ties, sometimes very close ties, with the Chinese Communist Party. The media is increasingly influenced by Beijing. One Hong Kong analyst said to me this week, if there's one thing the Communist Party knows, it's propaganda and the importance of controlling the levers of mass media in order to control the message. So the party has successfully infiltrated the media. How much longer is Lai going to be allowed to publish is another question altogether.
Well, interestingly about him, he has a yacht now, but when he was a 12-year-old boy, he fled. He was a refugee like so many others of the Hong Kong population on a boat from Guangdong. He
is the Hong Kong tale, absolutely.
He's absolutely the Hong Kong tale, and I think that a sign of how Hong Kongers are protesting to the extent that they can in this context. They're buying Apple shares, stock, and they're certainly subscribing more and more to his papers as a show of sort of indirect support for his case. Sophia, you reported out of Hong Kong for the Journal. I'm wondering what all this does for Hong Kong's place and image in the world as a global financial hub, as a freewheeling capitalist society that is also a shipping, a key shipping metropole. How is this likely to transform Hong Kong? Is it just going to be another city on China's coast, or is Hong Kong's way of life over?
Well, there was a time when Hong Kong played a role for China that China really needed. It was a connection to the world at a time when China was very close. They needed Hong Kong for its financial connectedness and for its courts and for its banks. So that's where a lot of Chinese companies could come and set up big deals and big IPOs. And they didn't have that themselves. Later that shifted, and suddenly China was more needed in Hong Kong. The relationship shifted so that Hong Kong needed China more than the other way around. So it's all been very sad to watch, obviously, and it's a special romanticism about Hong Kong. I don't think people understand what a wonderful place Hong Kong is in so many ways. It has been that for its free speech, its free voice, its special culture. It's also a beautiful place to live, and we see it before our eyes how a lot of that is just changing and going away, and it's sad.
Thank you. Julie, let's go to the questions from the audience. Hello from your friends in West Michigan. This is from my colleague, Michael Van Den End. Who's head of the Western Michigan World Affairs Council, what does Hong Kong mean for Taiwan's future?
China's maneuverings in Hong Kong portend a very rough ride for Taiwan. Xi Jinping has made it an article of faith for his leadership that the motherland of China will be reunited, its outposts brought back into the fold. Hong Kong's integration, it would appear, is well underway. Macau has never been really a problem outpost, but Taiwan is on another level of confrontation altogether. Beijing considers it a renegade province, has increasingly made bellicose threats about uniting with the mainland by force. And this is a serious flashpoint in East Asia, every bit as dangerous as the North Korea missile program. And the Taiwanese they're well armed, and the United States has been a significant seller of arms to them. But the talk about invasion does unsettle a lot of Taiwanese. One woman said to me last year, "We know how much the Chinese hate us." She used this expression, hate us. And we can't imagine what they would do to us if they do invade. So there is this deep sense of anxiety, but they still get on with it. The Taiwanese get on with it. And the 75-year-old antagonism really has reached new heights under Xi Jinping. Even the president of Taiwan, who's no fan of Beijing, has tried to extend a hand of conciliation. No one is more aware of the dangers that lurk across the Taiwan Strait than Taiwan. And this is interesting. We're living in the pandemic time. The fact that the pandemic has shown Taiwan to be such a well-oiled machine, in contrast to so many other countries, may also irk China. It's been held up for acclaim for its handling of the pandemic. And it's raised questions about why isn't Taiwan in, say, the World Health Organization? Though the answer being that China's very strong and doesn't want them there. But that has woken up capitals to the way in which Taiwan is treated in the world. But Hong Kong is definitely a cautionary tale for Taiwan. There's no doubt about it. And it's a scary prospect for a lot of Taiwanese who want to maintain their democracy.
Bob, I want to ask you about the big China's big trade deal from over the weekend, where many of the nations that are part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or its successor that the U.S. abandoned under Trump, have now aligned in a grouping with China. Certainly, there are big economic implications there. I'd also like you to talk about diplomatic implications, kind of on a parallel track as what Julie was saying about self-censorship. Are these nations, from New Zealand to Japan, able to criticize China the way they otherwise would?
Well, Australia is the poster boy for that at the moment, right? I mean, the Chinese are trying to pressure Australia to shut up and to, get in line and not be so openly critical of their policies. I don't think it'll work, and I think it'll backfire in the same way that internationally the national security law backfired on China. For all what I was saying about, let's say, modest kind of sanctions on China, what the national security law did was help the Trump administration, which usually operates in a unilateral fashion, line up support for a front, excuse me, against China. So now you come in and you have the Biden administration, which talks about moving away from the unilateral approach to a multilateral approach, right? And yes, it's true that there's a Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has an even more infelicitous name at the moment, which the U.S. isn't part of and isn't going to be part of, I don't think, even under Biden. And you have this new trade deal called RCEP that also lines up China with some big big economies there: Southeast Asia plus Japan plus Australia. Two things about it. One, from an American perspective, sounds worse than it is. I mean, it's basically a tariff cutting exercise. Not all tariffs are cut to zero. Not all products are included. It is a very low quality sort of trade deal in the sense that it doesn't cover lots and lots of areas that contemporary trade deals cover, like agriculture, like investments, all sorts of things. So on the one hand, yeah, it's a accomplishment for Chinese diplomacy. On the other hand, it's not that big a obstacle for America or American companies. It's something, but it's not as big as it's been, in my view, as big as it's been put out to be. So here you come, you get the Biden administration looking to sign up allies, or I mean, has allies obviously in the Pacific, but looking for a tighter coordination on China. And it has always been that those countries don't want to get in the middle of the United States and China because both are really important. The United States is not the biggest trading partner of those countries anymore. China is, but on the other hand, they don't want to be swallowed by China, and the United States is still the largest military power. So, I mean, it will be a challenge for the Biden administration, and this RCEP deal will only accentuate the challenge. But on the other hand, there's the example of Australia. So, I mean, I think that could be the best calling card for whoever in the world the Secretary of State is under Joe Biden to help sign up allies for a tougher approach toward China.
Speaking of America's foreign policy, I have a comment and a question from Julian Hayda. I'm going to direct this to you, Sophia. Julian is and to the organizers of this conference. Julian is disappointed that there aren't any Hong Kong-based reporters presenting here, and by that, I think the meaning is a Hong Konger. And so I'm sure, as a conference organizer myself, we do our best, and that will be something perhaps for next year. Julian's question is one about news judgment, Sophia. How much of America's foreign policy priorities determine what's worth reporting on by journalists like Bob and Julie?
It's a very good question. There are certain issues that captures the imagination of the American public more than others, and I want to say that makes it even more important to have journalists like someone like Lingling, who knows both countries so well and incorporates the thinking of both countries. And I want to explain that a bit more. When it's very hard for the Chinese government, whether in Hong Kong or in China, to understand the kind of journalism that Western companies, Western media organizations do, and to them it's all we're all a bunch of China haters who want to criticize China, and that is so far from the truth, because a lot of people who work in both Hong Kong and in China come to love these countries and are driven to work there because of a love and affection for the cultures. And so the recent expulsions that we've seen has really undermined that whole situation, and it's partly driven by the U.S. Right? The U.S. targeted Chinese journalists working in the U.S., and as a response to that, foreign journalists in China were targeted. So you could wonder who's gaining here, and even though it's initiated by the U.S., you could say that the U.S. is the loser in this proposition, because the world doesn't gain that much from Chinese state media journalists leaving the U.S. as it does from American Western journalists, people like Lingling, who have lived and loved these places and reported on them with great nuance. And not having them there really cuts down into the average American reader's understanding of what goes on in China. I'm not sure that answered the question, but that's my best attempt.
Great. Well, there's a follow-up to that from Howard Snyder. It's forward-looking, and maybe you, Sophia, and the others can answer it as well. Howard asks, how much of the expulsion of U.S. journalists lies with the U.S. and State Department actions against Chinese news organizations in the U.S.? And what do you think of the possibility of U.S. journalists returning to China under a Biden administration?
Let me talk about that because I've reported on that. So it depends on when you want to start this fight, right? I mean, the Wall Street Journal had 3 reporters thrown out of China, supposedly because of a headline in the editorial page. The 3 reporters that were thrown out had all reported on Xinjiang, and all were Mandarin speakers. Clearly, they knew who they were throwing out. So it's gone back and forth. So from the perspective of the State Department and NSC, agree with what I'm about to say or don't. They believed that the policy of China was to get rid of Western reporters. There's also the example of the Australian reporters who got, threatened and basically frightened out of the country. So their view was that this was what China wanted, and we are not going to put up with it. And so that started the tit for tat fight. I mean, in my view, it's totally self-defeating, right? I mean, we wind up with the United States winds up with fewer reporters in a country that doesn't care about freedom of the press. But still, just trying to explain how the Trump administration thought about it. For a Biden administration, looking for ways to not to go back to the way it was during Obama, but to look for areas of cooperation. Even the Trump administration said they were interested in cooperation as well as competition, although they basically never found areas of cooperation outside of trade. This would be a pretty easy way to start if they wanted, not saying they will, but it sounds like it's mostly symbolic. You could imagine, a face-saving deal for both sides that would put this, to an end. So I think it's a possibility of a way for, like many, many years ago, ping pong was, a way for the countries to, have some sort of, coming together. Maybe, journalist visas and so on might be.
Great, thanks, Bob.
Bill, can I just jump in for a second?
Please.
What
Yeah, go ahead.
Julian had asked. I think, sort of what motivates us, what are we doing out there, what are we prioritizing, what's the goal? I think in a place like the coverage of Hong Kong attracted so much attention in the world because it really was seen through the prism of human rights. It was seen less as a kind of a geopolitical grand struggle, although that is the framework. That is the framework. That's the big, large framework. But the nitty-gritty of that came down to this David versus Goliath struggle. And I think that's what really appealed to people in the world. They had an almost visceral reaction to what was happening in Hong Kong. And that really was about prioritizing human rights as an issue of coverage. I would go into the streets and I would see these US flags. You'd see flags from all over the world being draped, but the US flag was a prominent feature in these demonstrations, which always slightly, well, it was a source of wonderment to me. I didn't understand it. I thought it was odd. And then I began to see what they just look at the flag differently. They look at the American flag and they see a symbol of freedom. We look at the American flag, we see, patriotism. They don't look at it that way. This is a symbolic, very idealistic view of what democracy means, what freedom means. So you have these tropes that enter into these things that are sort of lost in translation in many ways, because we view images one way and the people on the ground will view them another way. But I think really that this was a prioritizing of human rights. It seemed to be the guiding principle.
It's interesting to think that, Britain took the territory after the first Opium War in the middle of the 19th century, and it was in fact a colony. So as free as it was, Hong Kong has never been a pure democracy. It's kind of like in the middle somewhere, and it's gone from one rule to another. But in that transition, I want to share Scott Bunton's mourning. I'm in mourning and have been for a year about what appears inexorably to be occurring in Hong Kong and where it will lead. Since my first visit there in '92, it's been my favorite city on the planet for all the reasons that Sophia mentioned. When it reverted in '97, the big question was whether China would kill the goose that laid the golden egg. It didn't immediately, while it still needed the intermediary services Hong Kong provided, but that need has faded over time as Shanghai, Guangzhou, and other Chinese financial and trade hotspots have developed capacity. Do the panelists believe that Beijing has concluded that Hong Kong is now fully expendable, and so it holds no cards that might slow or temper the trajectory toward complete absorption by the mainland? That's for any of you, or all of you.
I think, go ahead.
Well, there's still the courts, right? Hong Kong has its own court system, and that has proved valuable. For sure, Hong Kong's hopes to remain the place it has been has diminished with China's rise. It has just become so much less important and itself dependent on Chinese companies, and has fewer arguments for being needed in the world, in the eyes of China, of course. So so it's hard to say that there are hopes, and I'll let Bob take it from there.
I was going to say, I mean, Hong Kong's really, really important to Xi Jinping. Asserting Chinese control over it is one of his biggest priorities. And I know my colleague Lingling believes that was one of the reasons he signed the trade deal, which was pretty much signed on unfavorable terms to China. One reason was that he thought that would give him some leverage over the U.S. China agreed to buy $200 billion more of U.S. exports. You could tamp that down if as a message to the United States if clearly the expected backlash appeared. I mean, it didn't. It was a mistaken calculation, let us say. And in terms, I guess, economically, I mean, as Sophia has said, it's just less important to China than it once was. And I think, think of the foreign firms that are there, and have headquarters there. They do pretty well. I'm not saying this is a good thing, but they do pretty well operating in authoritarian regimes. It's not, yes, they would like more freedom of press and assembly and so on and so forth, but I'm not looking for profiles in courage from Western financial institutions in Hong Kong.
Julie, did you have a reaction?
Yeah, I think this. Yes, I think this whole question of is this a colony now in an expendable mode goes to the heart of what has happened, what's happened over the course of the past 20 years. As Sophia points out, it has diminished in its contribution, its economic and financial contribution to China. This had to have been a deliberate play, the diminishing of this place. But I will also say this, I will return to this. I mean, there's a longtime resident who said to me, in spite of everything that's happened, he said this week, Hong Kong has not changed, meaning to say Hong Kongers themselves. And that's important. And Hong Kongers will not suddenly change. Yes, activists will seek exile, and people are planning escape routes, and protests have gone quiet. But this is also very innovative. They're young. They're extremely intelligent bunch of people. And while it's easy to say the game's over, the local journalists say, "Look, we still do our work. We're more careful about how we're doing it. But we're still doing it." They're waiting for a credential crackdown to come. But I think it's easy from the outside to underestimate the fervor and the stakes that young people have in this fight. And I still, it's still an unwritten chapter. I mean, look what's changed in a year. Look what's changed in the matter of months. I think Hong Kong gives up surprises. And it may not, history may not be ending in Hong Kong.
Great. I want to offer sort of questions on the issues and then questions going back to journalism, and we'll close there in about 3 or 4 minutes. My colleague Derek Olson, who I know is the president of World Oregon, who I know has been paying close attention to the World Affairs Councils of America's conference, which has delved into climate change day after day and issues of international trade, among others, asks, Derek, thank you. How do you think the Biden administration will balance working with Beijing on climate change and working with Western allies against China's unfair trade practices?
It's going to be tough. I mean, it's going to be really tough. Biden has made clear his priorities are climate change, the pandemic, rejoining the Iran nuclear deal. He needs China for all of those. He has not said that trade is a big priority. In fact, he has said that he doesn't want to deal with trade until he, gets a domestic agenda through Congress. And also, if you just think about it, trade is such a divisive issue in the Democratic Party, so that he will try to ignore it as best he can, although it's hard when it comes to China. The obvious trade-off is, you, China, help us on climate change, and we, America, will reduce the tariffs that we have on 3/4 of everything you sell to China. I mean, that's the obvious trade. But there are many, many, many people who are arguing against that, and even the business community isn't lobbying for that sort of trade. They're lobbying for another round of trade talks and then reduce the tariffs, for the economic concessions. But it's a tough balancing act, without a doubt.
And Bob, I would add to that. This is Julie. I would add to that while RCEP is not this sophisticated, deep, comprehensive trade agreement, it does include an awful lot of territory and GDP and population. And what it signified on Sunday is that the United States is out of 2 major trade deals in Asia. We withdrew from TTP. Or TPP, and which is now CPTPP. And as you say, the whole agenda is going to be so domestic driven by a Biden administration that it's a hole. It seems to leave a hole for the United States in Asia that can't be good for American producers.
Great. So I want each of you to take a question from Ethan, or a set of questions from Ethan Jones, who's posed many of them in here, and he's been very patient. Define the priorities you have for covering Hong Kong and China in the year ahead. Is it necessary for reporters to get close to what you're reporting on? How do you plan to get the full story? How do you plan to get investigative stories? And what are you going to do, Julie, to be on the ground? The others are in the United States.
That's right. Well, to be on the ground right now is very difficult because you have a very tough time getting in there unless you have a resident permit right now. And the pandemic has sort of helped create restrictions for the Hong Kong authorities. They've used health restrictions, actually, to suppress the protests, and they're using health restrictions again to foil people who do come in. You're quarantined for 2 weeks, but as someone from the outside without a resident permit, I will have a very difficult time getting back on the ground in Hong Kong. And it is a huge problem, which again goes back to something Julian raised. There are extraordinary people on the ground doing extraordinary journalism. And one of them is the Hong Kong Free Press, which is just an incredible source. And it also goes back to something that Bob had said, which is, who are the real heroes of the peace? The real heroes of the peace in terms of press freedom and this whole question of the media are the people on the ground, the local people on the ground still slogging it out, doing investigations, winding up in court because of the investigations they've done at a time where winding up in court is a very dangerous proposition in Hong Kong right now. It is not the same as winding up in court a year ago. It's a very different bargain that you make. So I think we're going to be relying a lot more on people who are taking those sorts of risks. We can't at the moment get in there to take them.
Sofia, the new tripartite approach of the Journal to deputize you and others to cover this huge story of our #1 geopolitical rival, our economic rival. What's going on? What do you look ahead to?
Yeah, it's, I mean, as Julie said, journalists are inventive people and dogged people. So we will do this. We will do it well, I think. And this is a time when so much more is happening virtually. That said, you can't replace the street smells and the sense of place that you get from living somewhere, not to speak of the 13-hour time difference we're up against now. On the other hand, we now have people with deep China knowledge in the US, working with Washington reporters and other reporters, and the large Chinese diaspora. And that has changed the game also. So you just have to live with change and roll with it.
Bob, your book is Superpower Showdown, our mixed election in November. Nevertheless, within that context, there's been great bipartisanship on one issue, China. Does that portend the showdown will be this year?
Showdown is continuing. I mean, I think it's just one of the biggest stories of of this part of the 21st century, really. I mean, how the U.S. and China get along or don't get along, does what we think is basically a Cold War, although a different set of parameters than the one with the Soviet Union. Does it, God forbid, go into a shooting war? I mean, what happens with Taiwan? What happens with U.S.-China relations? I mean, I'll be doing my best, to cover this part of it from Washington, but I mean, it is just an enormously important story.
I want to thank Bob Davis, Sofia McFarland, and Julie McCarthy for presenting today. Thanks to the Santa Fe Journalism Under Fire and Sandy Campbell for organizing this and for inviting the World Affairs Councils to be a part of your conference and for you to be part of ours. It's a joy, and congratulations, Sandy, again on your Council of the Year award from WACA.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Sofia, for stepping in at the last minute. Really appreciated. And it was like you had been preparing for this for weeks and months. So thank you, Sofia. And Julie, please come. Julie's just such a remarkable speaker. We featured her a few months ago on Hong Kong, and I think we have a whole lot to talk about when it comes to China and Hong Kong and Taiwan and so on in the years to come. So you're all cordially invited to come to Santa Fe next year. We'll revisit all this. We'll get Lingling, I hope, as well. And thank you all so much for doing it.
Thank you.
And just for those of you out there who are going to be joining our conference interactive stream, it starts in 5 minutes. It's a different Zoom link, which you already have. So please be sure to click on that. Bring your questions, and we will see you then. For now, we will see you all later. Have a great day. Bye-bye.